Good morning. Some of you have no doubt looked at the bulletin already, and you've looked up here, and you've looked at the bulletin, and you've looked up here, and you've said, that ain't Anderson. We've had a little bit of a mix-up on the schedule this morning. One of the things that I have heard my whole time preaching, Rebecca, I'm sure this is something Robert used to say, you always got to have a pocket sermon. Always got to have a pocket sermon. Well, my pocket sermon today is the lesson that I had planned to preach tonight, which is a continuation of the series that we've already been engaged in. We've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount. We've been studying our way through that. We've already had a number of lessons from that, and this morning's lesson is a continuation of that as we continue our study. Those of you who have been here, this series has been going on Sunday evenings. Those of you who have been here to hear those first lessons, we find that Jesus, as we continue this study, he is still discussing the righteousness of the kingdom. And one of the things that we notice, back up in verse 20, we're in Matthew chapter 5, back up in verse 20, we notice that Jesus has already told us that our righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. And in last week's lesson, we looked at the subject of murder. He talked about the subject of murder. And so now he's addressing the subject of adultery. And so as we consider his words on this subject and the ones that follow in the next lesson that deal with divorce, it may be that we find his teachings in some cases hard to accept. But Jesus warned us. He's already warned us that the righteousness that is expected of those who will be citizens of the kingdom is one with very high standards. Therefore, if we truly desire to be citizens of that kingdom, we've got to accept what it is that Jesus expects of us. And so on the subject of adultery, we notice that Jesus, this is our first point this morning, Jesus goes beyond the traditional interpretation and application of the seventh commandment, of the Ten Commandments, commandment number 7. Let's read verses 28 through 30 together. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out and throw it away from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for the whole body to go into hell. Let's talk about the traditional interpretation and application. This evidently stressed that as one did not actually engage in the act, the physical act of adultery, one wasn't guilty. Thereby this emphasizes the letter of the law, but doesn't appreciate the spirit of the law that's behind that. But what we see is that Jesus interprets and applies the law differently. He is telling us that one doesn't actually have to commit the act to be guilty of adultery. One is just as guilty in his heart when one looks at a woman to lust for her. So note that it's not the looking only. It's not the looking only, but to lust for her that's what is wrong. To lust means to have a strong desire for her, to desire to possess and dominate. It possesses you and dominates you completely. A person can look at another person with admiration for beauty and not be guilty of lust. You know, you see the situation where someone has on a dress that matches their eyes. Oh, it makes your eyes pop. That's not lust. What that is, that's an appreciation for how color accentuates your attributes. Jesus, I want us to understand this now. The interpretation of Jesus in this was actually in keeping with what the law of Moses taught. Let's go back to what the Ten Commandments say. Let's look now at the 10th commandment. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. Notice that the 10th commandment condemned coveting a neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male slave, or his female slave, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So you know, one of the things that as an aside here that jumps out at me, and this was one of the things that I thought about as I was preparing this lesson. When we look at print media, I would tell you that there are two big rules of thumb that people in print media follow. And to some degree, this goes into actually to a large degree, it goes into electronic media as well. If you think about the news and those kinds of things. The first one that comes to mind isn't related to our lesson, but it's this: if it leads, it bleeds. Anybody ever hear that? That means that when whatever is the biggest catastrophe is what you're going to lead the news with. And you stop and think about that. They don't start the newscast with some human interest story about some marvelous thing that happened in Podunk over in West Tennessee or over in East Tennessee or whatever it is. They start with who was it that got killed, or what got blown up, or, oh, by the way, we're in the middle of a war now, right? That's what they lead with. Here's the second principle. This is one that applies to what we're talking about today. This is what's used in the advertisements you see. Sex sells. Ever hear that? If you haven't heard it, you surely do see it when you look on your television or you look in print. They use people dressed inappropriately to sell everything. Toilet paper. I mean, think about it. Toilet paper. But yes, they do. And so what we're talking about here is that our society is geared, it is designed, it is configured to actually cause us not to follow this. What that means is for us to be these faithful citizens of the kingdom, we actually have to make a concerted effort not to allow the world to change us, not allow the world to make us be who they want us to be. And so I want us also to understand this isn't new. And that's why I made this point right now, because the next verse I want us to look at comes from what many scholars believe is the oldest book in the Bible. That is the one that was written first. And that's the book of Job. Turn with me to Job chapter 31 and verse 1. Because even in the time of Job, to look at a woman to lust for her was considered wrong. Job said this in Job 31 and verse 1. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look at a virgin? What's the point he's making? I'm making it a point by how I live my life not to lust after a woman. One of the interesting things about the ancient Jews, there was actually a group that was known as the Bleeders or the Bleeding Pharisees. And the story goes that these men tried to demonstrate their piety, their extreme piety, by refusing to look at women at all. And so to avoid the possibility of seeing a woman, they would walk around with their eyes closed when or they would, if there was a woman, they would immediately turn their head away. Well, you can imagine walking around with your eyes clenched shut all the time creates some problems when you're trying to navigate around, right? You're going to step in places, you're going to miss steps, you're going to run. So they were constantly pounding their heads into things and causing themselves to bleed. Even other Pharisees, remember the Pharisees were the group that were known for this whole self-righteousness thing. Even other Pharisees would look at these guys and mock them because those things were done to look holy rather than to live righteously. But that said, it shows that even among the Pharisees, there were those who understood the way that the old law treated this idea of lust. And so serious is such lusting that Jesus goes on to say what we should do with respect to the lustful eye or any other stumbling block. Let's look now again at verses 29 and 30. Now, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So let's talk about this whole pluck out your eye thing. Let me make it very clear that the fact that Jesus isn't being literal here should be obvious. Because here's the deal. I pluck out my right eye, cut off my right hand. Does that keep me from doing the same thing with my left eye, my left hand? No. I mean, the point is that what we're doing is recognizing the seriousness of what we're talking about. Matthew 18, verses 7 through 9 is another place where Jesus talks about this. Matthew chapter 18, verses 7 through 9. Jesus there says, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to the person through whom the stumbling block comes." And let's establish right now, as we're going into the rest of this passage, we're talking about stumbling blocks. We're talking about things that are causing people to sin. Tim saw me deal with that right here at the beginning before services this morning. I miscounted steps as I was going down looking at my phone and nearly ended up out here in the middle of the floor. That's the physical stumbling block, right? But the thing is, when we're talking about spiritual stumbling blocks, they are things that cause people to be tempted and to sin. And so what Jesus then goes on to say here, if your hand or your foot is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you. It is better for you to enter life maimed or without a foot than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your left eye is causing you to sin, if your eye, I don't know where I got left. If your eye is causing you to sin, tear it out and throw it away from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into fiery hell. I want you to stop just for a moment and think about some of these athletes. Think about some of these athletes. And I can think of 2 or 3 right off the top of my head, Tennessee Titans, that years ago I would hear things about them and think, these are people whose loyalty to their friends is getting them in trouble. Think about people who continue to hang out with people who lead them into the wrong places. When we look at what we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, I'll give you the 1901 American Standard Version rendering of that. "Be ye not deceived, evil companionships corrupt good morals." What's that mean? It means your friends, if they're the wrong kinds of friends, can lead you into the wrong places. So, and it doesn't have to just be friends. It can be work situations. It can be a whole lot of different things. But what we're talking about here is that the eye and the hand in this passage represent offenses. Offenses are stumbling blocks that lead a person to sin. These are enticements to do wrong. These are what we might call beguiling allurements. And the idea that we're trying to present here is that if we've got those things in our life and we're not able to overcome them, what do we need to do? We need to put them away from us. We need to cut them out of our lives. And so the meaning of Jesus here is that we need to take drastic action in getting rid of whatever in the natural course of events will tempt us to sin. One of the things I've talked about before, there are 4 avenues of temptation. There are 4 avenues of temptation, or 4 ways rather, not avenues of temptation, but 4 responses, is a better way of putting it. There are 4 responses to temptation. 1, we can avoid it. 2, when we encounter it, we can flee from it. 3, we can steel ourselves and overcome it. Or 4, we can give in to it. You notice that 3 out of 4 don't result in us sinning, right? 3 out of 4 don't result in us sinning. Jesus is telling us, find one of those 3 in any situation to use to overcome temptations. And this should be the case in all kinds of sin. I realize that the focus of this morning's lesson deals with adultery, but this is any kind of sin, right? This isn't just adultery. And so as we contemplate then upon Jesus' words, there are several, as we move into our 3rd point this morning, there are several important lessons for us to learn. And the first thing that I want to emphasize is that the present, that is where we're living right now, is not our only life. I want you to understand, we are destined for eternity. Every soul represented in this room has eternity ahead of it. Every single one. The future holds the possibility of hell. The word that Jesus uses here, hell, is Gehenna, the place of everlasting torment. What we do or do not do in the present determines where we spend our future. And so nothing, no matter how precious it may seem to be right now, should be allowed to hinder us from receiving our glorious reward. God's goal for every person here this morning is the kingdom of heaven in all of its glory. There is absolutely, hear me when I say this, there is absolutely nothing here on earth that's worth losing that. Nothing. Nobody, nothing. Number 2, sin is a very destructive force, and it cannot be pampered. Sin is to the soul what cancer is to the body. We've got people in our audience this morning who have dealt with cancer. Probably every person here has lost a family member at some point to cancer. And we know that if you wait too long to address it, you wait too late. Halfway measures, half-hearted effort, that only gives time for sin to wreak havoc upon us. What is needed is radical surgery, and that's exactly what Jesus is prescribing here, right? If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Radical surgery to treat this cancer of sin. Cut off those things that might lead you to look after others, look upon others, to lust after them, because that will potentially keep you from your heavenly home. Stumbling blocks can be books. It might be movies. It might be pictures. It might be being in certain situations. Avoid those things. How much better is it for us to dwell on good things? Think about what Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence and anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about those things that Paul talks about here. Those are the things that will help us to get to heaven, not keep us out of it. So, the effect of what Jesus taught is challenging. But if it wasn't possible, Jesus wouldn't require it of us. I want you to think about a couple of passages here. Matthew chapter 11 what we call the great invitation. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable and my burden is light." I want to focus on that last phrase, my burden is light. It's basically the same thing that John tells us in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3. "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." Or what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. "I beseech you, brethren, therefore, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable service." This idea that we'll hear this. What you've got to do to be a Christian is just too hard. It's only too hard if we are setting our minds on keeping one foot in the world and one foot in the kingdom. That's hard to do. Trying to walk straddling the fence, that's impossible to do. It is hard. But when we devote ourselves to serving God faithfully, it becomes much easier. Those commandments aren't nearly as difficult then. And here's the other thing. In our efforts, we're not alone, because God and Jesus are with me. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, Paul says, "So then, my beloved, just as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to desire and to work for his good pleasure." God's working in us. When we choose to follow him and to do his will, God works in us, which is the reason why Paul can then say in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Jesus teaches us in this passage, it's not just about what we do with our hands. It's what happens with our heart. The scribes and the Pharisees had reduced the commandment to the outward act only. Jesus takes it back, just as he did with murder and anger. He now does the same thing with adultery and lust. He takes it back to what it really is. It's a heart problem. You know, sin, we talk about it being cancer. It's also heart disease, right? It's both. Jesus brings it back to the source, the desires, the thoughts, the intentions that lead to sin. And so that means that the real battleground is inside each of us. It's possible for a person to appear righteous outwardly while the heart is in the process of drifting towards sin. But the same Lord who exposes the heart also offers cleansing for it. If you've never obeyed the gospel, understand that the Lord calls you not just to reform your behavior, but to give him your life, to give him your heart. Through faith in Christ, through repentance, through confession of his name, through baptism for the remission of sins, you can be made clean. And if you're already a Christian, but you recognize that you've allowed sinful thoughts, desires, habits to take root, this today is the time to deal with it. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Today is the day of salvation. Jesus said that if something causes you to stumble it, remove it. Sin is too destructive to tolerate, but the good news, we don't have to do this alone. He's not putting us out on an island and expecting us to handle this all by ourselves. As we read earlier, God is at work in us, giving us both the desire and the strength to do what's right. So this morning, if you need forgiveness, if you need prayers, if you need the strength that comes from the Lord and his people, this is the time. If you need to respond in obedience, be buried with him in baptism and arise to walk in newness of life, this is the time. Won't you come as together we stand as we sing.